Good morning. A little bit of a light crowd. Apparently they heard I was speaking. Appreciate that. I appreciate you who showed up. Last night, my niece got married, and they asked me to officiate the wedding. So there are two things that had to happen. One, I had to get a suit. Now, those of you who know me know this is unusual for me to wear a suit. Certainly one that fits. This is not from Goodwill. This is probably the only suit I've had since my mom actually made me a suit that fits. She did make me a suit. Speaking of which, my mom's here today, as well as my sister and my brother-in-law, who's like my brother. They're here today. So the second thing that had to happen for me to be able to do this wedding is I had to get ordained. So I have this badge that, if you'd like, I'll wear this on stage to make you feel better about me speaking today. It says clergy. It's remarkably easy to be ordained, maybe a little concerningly easy to be ordained. But for some reason, that my niece is a very, shall we say, whimsical person? Quirky might be another word. And they wanted a wedding service that matched her personality. And so for some reason, they thought I was the guy for the job. Thank you all for coming this morning. I'd like to extend my welcome as well. Bob, thank you for stepping in and leading singing. Greg's out as well. So it's really great to be at a church where so many people can step up and they can fill the gaps that need to be filled and things can happen that need to happen. The title of the lesson today is called Come As You Are. My printer's broken, so I'm going to try to go digital today. So if I just stop talking at some point, it's because I'm frantically trying to figure out how to get back to my document. We're going to start with talking about the story of the prodigal son that you find in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. We've talked about this story from birth, basically. This is something that is talked about in the earliest classes. We talk about the story of the prodigal son. So you know the story. This young man leaves. He asks his father for all of his inheritance, and he says, I want out. I'm leaving. And he takes his money, and he goes somewhere else, and he makes horrible, terrible choices. He shows himself to be completely undeserving of the gifts that have been given to him, of what his father entrusted to him. Now, when he's there in this country, this far country, he basically just blows the money that he's been given. He spends it on terrible things. He spends it on the worst things that you can imagine. At some point, though, he hits rock bottom and realizes he's got nothing and nowhere to go. He's got nowhere to turn. And at that point, he realizes, I need to go home. I need to be back where my father is. Now, keep in mind that this son had not solved any of the problems he had created. Not one. He had not earned back a penny of the money he spent. He had lived this life, and the only change that he had made so far was deciding to walk away from it. So he had done nothing whatsoever to prove himself trustworthy to his family, and especially his father. But if you look in chapter 15, verse 20, it says, But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Now, one of the key things I want you to see in there is that he ran to his son. He didn't wait for his son, he ran to his son. So at this point, the son tries to tell the father that he's not worthy to be there. He's trying to say, I know I blew it. And his dad won't have anything to do with that, and he welcomes him back with honor. The father doesn't first point out all the ways he's messed up. He doesn't give him a list of demands that he needs to meet before he can come back home. The father runs out to meet him where he's at. Now, who doesn't run out to meet him? His own brother. His brother is upset that he's come back. His brother's reaction is, you haven't been like me. You haven't earned the right to be here with me. You haven't earned the right to be treated with honor. But the father's way is to let the son fail. He lets him make his own choices. He lets him fail, and then is there for him. And beyond there for him, he goes to meet him, even after he fails. Now, in the past, I've read this and thought the part about the older son was really about the Jews versus the Gentiles. That was kind of what I thought the understanding was. And to some extent, yes, that's what it's about. But I believe it goes far beyond that. I think it's a much, much broader application than that. The Gospels spend a great deal of time talking about the religious and political leadership that was going on with the Jews. You'll hear the Pharisees mentioned a lot, you'll hear the Sadducees mentioned a lot, and you'll hear the priests mentioned a lot. These are people who had the authority to throw you in jail. Okay? These are people who had the authority to demand that people be beaten, stoned, imprisoned. These are the people that charged Jesus and took them to the Romans to be executed. So the Gospels talk about these people a lot, and none of it is in a good way. Read through it and try to find something where God says, you know what, the Pharisees have it right on this one. There is not one good mention about these leaders in the New Testament. These are people who lived by the letter of the law and beyond. Now, I believe that they are in there as a warning to us, that we who already have a relationship with the Father have to be very careful how we interact with people who are around us and outside of our body. We have to be very careful not to be the older brother who's upset that someone's coming in and getting honor that we think is ours. We have to be careful to avoid the smugness and elitism that we see with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the priests. Now, our church has made a commitment to be part of this community. And it's in our mission. I love that. I think that is fantastic. I love that the things that we see going on, we're interacting in ways that most churches couldn't even imagine. We're interacting in the schools. We're being able to do things that are just, I think the only way you could describe it is Spirit-led. They're just things that are not possible to happen. And that is fantastic. And so I don't want you for a minute right now to think that I'm saying we're doing something wrong. What I'm actually want to be talking about today is how we're prepared to do more. How we're to be prepared to go beyond where we are and continue to interact with this community. Now, we're looking to make an impact on the people that are all around us, the people in our community, the people that live down the street. We're not necessarily looking to recruit people from other churches. People want to come here, that's fantastic. What we're actually looking to do is touch people's lives that are in our community and have them meet God. Now, if we do that job well, we're going to be coming in contact with people from all different backgrounds. We're going to be coming in contact with people who do not think like we do, people who do not dress like we do. They're not going to know what we think is proper. They're not going to know how they should act in church, from our perspective. They're not going to know all the rules of decorum that we think are appropriate, and they're not going to yet know the Word of God. Think about that. Someone who's coming in without foreknowledge. What should our expectation be of that person who doesn't yet know the Word of God? So let's look at, in short, this is people who will make us very uncomfortable. We like the way things are. We like the way we do things. And this is going to challenge our comfort level on a regular basis. So let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 20. Turn in your devices, your electronic devices or books. You know, it used to be able to tell people were at the passage by when the flipping of pages slowed down. And now you can't tell. I don't know if you're looking or not. Feel free to check me on these, though. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 20 says, "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us." So the question is, what role does an ambassador play? An ambassador is the face of who they're representing. They are the emissary. They are the representative of who they are speaking for. Now, we make decisions every day about stores, about restaurants, about businesses based on their ambassadors that they put in front of us. We decide whether we like a place or dislike a place based on the ambassadors that they put in front of us and how they interact with us. We decide whether we want to do business with someone because of who we are interacting with. So this is something that is really part of our everyday life, and it shouldn't be a surprise to us. So how we interact with people as ambassadors of Christ becomes really, really important if we look at it in that light. Because what we are being is the representatives of Jesus. People will make decisions about who Jesus is based on us. So it puts a burden on us to really think about how would Jesus interact with this person. We are Christ's ambassadors. We are his representatives. We are his emissaries. Decisions about who God is, who Jesus is, and what kind of relationship could and should be had with them will be made based on the way we interact, based on who we are and how we act. Now, if you stumble into a situation for which you are not prepared, where you've put no planning, and you've never experienced this situation before, how likely are you to fail at it? So if you've never been taught how to do something, you never practiced something, how likely are you to do it right the first time? So I think for us to be able to interact with the community the way we need to, we might have to practice at it. We might have to talk about it and find ways to put it in practice before we're in situations where we're in over our heads. So what should our interactions look like? James chapter 1, verses 19 through 20 says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." Now, a section of this from the Amplified Version says, "Understand this, my beloved brethren. Let every man be quick to hear, a ready listener, slow to speak, slow to take offense, and to get angry." So to me, the biggest takeaway from that is listen first. There's no speaking in front. It says listen first. That means we have to seek first to understand. And in order to understand, there has to be conversation. This is conversation where we have to listen first. We have to know the person through this conversation. We have to know where they're coming from. We have to know the situation, and we have to know the motives. You have to have a relationship, basically, to have this kind of interaction. It doesn't start with talking, it starts with listening. So if someone you don't know comes up to you at the grocery store and starts giving you advice, what's your reaction? Thank you. I'm going to go, right? That's that's the light version, right? We're not going to be really receptive to someone who's coming in that we don't know who's giving us advice. Or if someone's coming to us and trying to give us advice and we see something in them that doesn't match what they're saying, how likely are we going to accept that advice? If you know someone that you care about, that you respect, that you trust, it's an entirely different matter. You're going to listen to them in a very different way because you give value to the words that they're saying. So in order for someone to listen to us, we need to have a relationship with them first. We need to listen first. Let's go back to the point about stumbling into a situation for which we're not prepared. I work at a creative company, and it's one where people get their jobs because they're very skilled at certain things. They're very skilled artists, and that's what they do. So I have different expectations of my leaders and the people who do those jobs. I have very different expectations, especially if they are new to that job that they're doing. I have a very different expectation. So from the experienced people and the leaders to the people who just come in the door, I have entirely different expectations about what they're going to bring to the table. Now, new leaders are often people who've been very high-level individual performers. They've become exceptional at what they do. And so oftentimes the next step is to leadership. And I will tell you that sometimes they are the worst prepared for leadership because they are so good at what they do, they can't remember what it was like to not be good at it. They do things so quickly, so easily. There's so much that is just ingrained in them that they can't stop down enough to be able to say, oh, you don't even get the basics of this, and I have to go back and explain it. So I spend a lot of my time working with young leaders to teach them how to interact with their team. I kind of become a coach of coaches. This is how you talk to your team. And some of the things that I work with a lot is basically to tell them you can't have the same expectations for the kid who's right out of school that you have for yourself. I also tell them you can't be frustrated with an inexperienced person if you've never showed them how to do something. You have to earn their trust by being trustworthy. Good instruction, patience, and kindness go much, much further than anger, badgering, and belittlement. When I took the job I have now, the previous management that was there managed through anger, through belittlement, through badgering. And so I came into this team that was shell-shocked. And what I had to do was figure out how I could interact with them and help them move forward. And so the first thing I had to do, I had to listen. I had to show them that I was willing to listen to where they were and what they were struggling with. If I had come in barking orders, there's no way that I would have been able to get this team together again. Their experiences from the past were being brought into our relationship. I had to listen to that. I had to understand the experiences that they were bringing in so that we could interact in the right way. What I did first was listen to them so that then they would be able to listen to me. So we need to be training for how to interact with people the way the Father interacted with the prodigal son. This is not something that comes naturally to us. These are things that we're not going to just off the cuff be able to do. We're going to need to diligently practice this. I'm going to give you an example that you might think is a silly example, but it's something that happened here. You guys all know Trek, right? Okay, Trek, if you haven't been on Trek, is one of the most powerful things I've ever seen that our youth do. They go up the mountain, A, thinking this is going to be a really cool camping trip. B, they don't realize what they're in for. C, they often meet God on the mountain. For the first time, they experience that God is real. They've heard an academic education about God most of their lives, maybe. But this is the first time they are there and they are actually experiencing God. So this is an extremely powerful moment. So a few years ago, we were there, and Garrett decided that he wanted to be baptized. But he wanted to be here with his mom to do it. And so we made the decision that we were going to drive back and get here on time for church on Sunday. So we got here way earlier than we intended to. So we drove through the night in that rickety bus that we used to have, right? Now, if you've ever tried to sleep on a bus, this is worse, okay? The seats don't recline. There is no place to sleep. I was trying to figure out how to turn around in the seat and getting people like sleeping under the seats on the floor. So basically, we tried to sleep on this bus on the way back so we could be here Sunday morning to be with our friend Garrett, who was being baptized. Now, a funny thing happened. We were exhausted. A couple of the guys forgot to take their baseball caps off. They've been wearing them all week, and they forgot to take their baseball caps off. And people were angry. People made a big deal about these guys not taking their baseball caps off in church. I understand where you're coming from. There's a respect there, right? We look at it and say, disrespectful kids, right? But there wasn't first an understanding of the situation that they had been in and maybe why that situation was going on. Now, we had a young man who is not a man that grew up going to church. He has a wonderful heart, but he has not had a background that's really taught him about God. His connection with God has really been through these people over here. And he was one of those kids wearing a hat. Thankfully, nobody got in his face and said anything. But can you imagine what would happen to this young man who saw God being experienced on the mountain, and someone from church said, "You're disrespectful. You're wearing your hat in church." Can you imagine what would have happened? And what his thought would be about who we are. So in every situation, even if we're looking at it and we're thinking we understand what the situation is, you can't understand until you talk by first listening to understand what the situation is. Like I said, I know that seems like a silly example, but you can see how very quickly a young man's life could have been put down a different path because of a conversation that started without listening. So how does our training start? First of all, it begins with understanding who we are relative to God and relative to the people we are interacting with. Basically, we need to understand who we are in this conversation. James chapter 2 talks about favoritism being forbidden. And chapter 2, verse 10, it says, "For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it." In verse 12, it says, "Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment." So the words that James uses here sound very much like the words that Jesus spoke in Matthew chapter 9. So this is where he had called Matthew, and he had said, "Matthew, follow me," and he did. So they went to Matthew's house, and for lack of a better term, Matthew threw a party. And Matthew invited his friends. Who are his friends? People who had been like Matthew. They were tax collectors. They were sinners. Those are the people that he brought to his house. Now, the religious elite that we talked about earlier were giving Jesus all kinds of grief about the people that he was interacting with there. These were people that they considered to be undesirable. And in verse 12, Jesus says, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And there he's quoting Hosea. Romans chapter 3, verse 23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus." So as we're interacting with each other as well as with people outside this body, we must remember that we're all sick. We all need the doctor. The problem is that sometimes it becomes easy to act like we are the doctor. I've heard too many lessons over the years, thankfully not from this pulpit, about how we're right and they're wrong. About how we've got it figured out and they don't. At the base of it all, we're all wrong. And it's easy to forget that. We're all in need of the doctor, and only by the grace of God do we have healing and salvation. Now, if we can start there with an admission of our own guilt, it entirely changes the conversation that we have with people. Instead of demanding that they meet our standards, as the Pharisees did, we are simply introducing them to the same God that showed us undeserved mercy. Our interaction with others and our relationship with others has a direct impact on who they think God is. And as we discussed, as Christ's ambassadors, we need to act like someone who has been given a gift of grace that we have not earned. We need to act like we're living in freedom that was purchased by someone else. So what does acting like that look like? Chandler always laughs at me when I say that, but that's the way I think. What does that look like? Because we can talk about it all day long, and if we never really say, what does that look like, we don't get to the practicality of it. So what does acting like that look like? Interestingly enough, these are passages I used in the wedding last night. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 8 is an amazing description of what that interaction looks like. It says, "Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails. Now I'm going to read this again from the Amplified Version, because the level of detail it brings to the mind is something that's really powerful. Love endures long and is patient and kind. Love is never envious, nor boils over with jealousy. It's not boastful or vainglorious. It does not display itself haughtily. It is not conceited, arrogant, and inflated with pride. It is not rude, unmannerly, and does not act unbecomingly. Love, God's love in us, does not insist on its own rights or its own way, for it is not self-seeking. It is not touchy or fretful or resentful. It takes no account of the evil done to it. It pays no attention to a suffered wrong. It does not rejoice at injustice and unrighteousness, but rejoices when right and truth prevail. Love bears up under anything and everything that comes, is ever ready to believe the best of every person. Its hopes are fadeless under all circumstances, and endures everything without weakening. Love never fails, never fades out, or becomes obsolete, or comes to an end. When you look at this example it describes, it's an example of loving actively, proactively, not reactively. It is a love that is intentional with the full knowledge of the other's imperfections. It's an example of loving in action, not reaction. Now, if we really want to be a church that's in the community and that welcomes the community in, we have to be prepared for things to be messy. We don't like messy. We like order. We like when things go the way that we want them to go. But if we are truly bringing in people from all kinds of different backgrounds, it's going to be messy. I can only imagine what the church in Jerusalem was like after the day of Pentecost. Okay? Yes, they were all former Jews. They were still Jews, because it's a nationality. Sorry. They were of the Judaistic religion that became Christians. But they were from all different countries. The apostles had to speak in different languages. Remember, they were given the gift of tongues so they could speak to them in a language that they understood, right? Can you imagine the mess of these 3,000 people, which quickly grew to 5,000 people, trying to figure out how to interact? Day one, what do we do now? Day two, can you imagine them just trying to figure out what was next? You know, later on in the New Testament, there are instructions for orderly worship, right? And that's not about, being somber. And it was about, you're all trying to talk at the same time. Take turns, right? You've all got kind of stuff, you got things to say, right? You're all excited. Let's take turns in how we do that. That's really what that was mentioning. So for those who are mature in their faith, our first expectation can't be like that they are like us. Our first expectation can't be that they walk in the door and understand how everything works. Time and time again in their letters to churches, the apostles deal with people who are trying to enforce their traditions on others. These people have drawn conclusions about what is right based on their own experience. You've heard the term necessary inference, right? It's something that we've grown up with. Necessary inference is a dangerous thing. If you are inferring it for yourself, you have to be very careful that you are not inferring something for someone else that the Scriptures do not say. Now, we have to make choices for ourselves about what we believe the Bible is saying, but sometimes we say, I want to act this way. I've made the decision I'm going to act this way. We have to be very careful about making those things binding. Circumcision was a big topic in the New Testament, right? This is something that, from the Jews' experience, was critical. You had to do this. And so they made the inference that everyone else needed to do it. And the apostles said, no, you don't. That's not part of what God laid out. So we have to be very careful about the decisions we make for our lives, whether those are something that should be binding on others. We cannot try to enforce our expectations based on personal preference or tradition. And even if we are 100% scripturally correct, how we communicate is critical at that point. Like the father in the story of the prodigal son, we have to be ready to meet them where they are in the state they're in. We have to meet them with love, with acceptance, and with the willingness to listen first. We have to start with the willingness to build a relationship first, and we cannot go in with wagging fingers and raised eyebrows. I am in no way saying that we condone and accept sin. Don't for a second think that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that if we have an understanding of the grace that's been extended to us, we are able to interact with the people around us in an entirely different way.
Amen.
We need to learn to show that grace as ambassadors. So how we interact with each other is a critical part of how the world sees God. John writes about this intricate relationship that we have with God and with Jesus. In chapter 14, verse 20 in the book of John, he says, "On that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you." Kind of a hard concept to grasp. We are connected to God through Jesus. John chapter 17, verse 20 says, "Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me." Did you catch that? So that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I and them, and you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved me, even as you have loved them, even as you have loved me. So how we interact is something that is important to how our relationship with God is perceived, and therefore how God is perceived. We are connected to God through Jesus. How did that happen? He came out to meet us. He came out to meet us where we were, in the state we're in, whatever situation we were, however messed up we were. He didn't say, "Meet my expectations first." The gift of grace and relationship was given first. So our ability to interact with unity and love is what allows the world to see grace. It allows them to see that we are different, but in a good way. Now, I'll be honest, the reality is I am a failure. I am incredibly adept at failing. I have proven my ability to make enormous blunders. Does this sound familiar to you? I'm not just talking about me, but yes, I am talking about me. How can I expect perfection from anybody else when I have done the things that I have done and I have received the grace that I have received? How can I expect perfection from anybody else? We live imperfectly, we love imperfectly, we obey imperfectly, we worship imperfectly, and with the very best of intentions, we fail every single day. And for those of us who think we don't fail every day, we're going to start a study on pride after this. Several years ago, we were praying for direction for James Group Ministries. And I think I've shared this with you before. We were trying to figure out what happens next. And I believe God put a picture in my head, but it wasn't for the James Group. It was for Webb Chapel Church of Christ. And it was a picture of what this church could be. The picture that he put in my head was more like a hospital. It was like an emergency room, more than a traditional church. It was reaching out to people with desperate needs who are broken and don't know where else to turn. People from all walks of life that are just looking for help, who in our early stages of contact with them don't even realize that they're looking for God. They're just looking to survive one more day. They're just looking for healing, much like many who came to Jesus during his ministry. They came to him for healing. They may or may not have any church background. And if they have a church background, it may be entirely different from ours. And if they have a church background, they may actually have been damaged and scarred by it. We can be the church that loves them and serves them. We can be the church that goes out to meet them. And the love that I see in this church every day is something that tells me that this picture that he put in my head is possible. I don't know how it happens. I don't know when it happens, but I believe we're on that path. And as I said before, this lesson is not about how, hey, we're all doing it wrong. It's guys, how do we get prepared for the people that he could send our way? And I don't think he's going to send them our way until we're prepared. Because he's going to care for them the way that he cares for us, and is going to want to make sure that they are cared for in the right way. We can be the church that runs out to meet them where they are, in the situation they're in, knowing that their lives are a mess. But with God's help and with God's guidance, we'll walk with them through that mess. I'm going to close with Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. Jesus is in his ministry, and it says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. That description of what he saw is powerful. Have you ever felt harassed and helpless? Do you meet people every day who seem harassed and helpless and they don't know where to turn? The key word in this for me is compassion. That's how Jesus felt when he saw them. He didn't feel irritation. He didn't feel better than them. He felt compassion for them. Jesus sees the mess we're in. He sees the mess we are, and he has compassion on us. So Jesus came out to meet us where we are. So our task as ambassadors of Christ is to show that compassion to the world. In that way, people will see that we are truly saved by a loving and a merciful God. Now, I believe that God has big things in store for this church. And I believe that he is preparing us on a regular basis for that to happen. There's something special here. But I think we still have our biggest work ahead of us. Can you imagine if these halls and these rooms were filled with people who are just seeking help? And if God gives us the ability to do that, to guide them through this, to walk with them with compassion, sharing with them that we've been in their shoes before in one form or another. Can you imagine what that would look like, what that would feel like to be able to touch our community in that way? Now, this is difficult for us to do. It does not come naturally to us. We may have to help each other do this. This may require conversation. We may have to say, oh man, I was in this situation, I did this, and I shouldn't have done that. Let me backtrack. Let me make sure that I'm sharing something with this person. Just last week, someone was upset with me about words I said. When we talked about it later, the words that I said and the words that were heard were exactly the same. The meaning that I had and the meaning that was heard was entirely different. If we hadn't talked about it, we'd still be having a problem. But we sat down and we said, this is what we discussed, and we discussed it in a very open and loving way. This is the way we need to approach this kind of interaction. Now is the time for the invitation. And if you have struggles that you are going through, things you need to share with the church, you know that this church will pray with you, that this church will surround you and love you. And we have shepherds who will come down front, and they will pray with you as well. So if you have needs, please come as we stand and sing. Bring Christ your broken life.